They told us the war was already over. Not in the way wars usually end, with treaties signed, flags lowered, some dignified ceremony where both sides pretend they still have honor left. No, this was different. This was the kind of over where one side simply stops existing as a threat, where the numbers are so lopsided, so brutally mathematical, that continuing to fight becomes a statistical joke. The Vothran Collective had run those numbers. They were very good at numbers. And according to every calculation they'd made, every probability matrix, every tactical projection, every cold and merciless data point pulled from 500 years of interstellar warfare, humanity should have folded 6 weeks ago. We hadn't got that memo. My name is Sergeant First Class Dara Osei, and I'm going to tell you what I watched happen on the surface of HFY, on the morning that changed the entire shape of this war. But first, I need you to understand what we were walking into. Because if you don't understand what hopeless looked like from where I was standing, you won't understand why what happened next still makes the hair on my arms stand up when I think about it. Even now, even after everything. So let me take you back. Let me take you to the beginning of that day. The setup. HFY is not a pretty planet. I want you to imagine something first. Before I get into the tactical stuff, before I start throwing around unit designations and grid coordinates, I want you to just close your eyes for a second and imagine the ugliest, most hostile piece of real estate you've ever seen. Now make it worse. The sky on HFY is a color that doesn't really have a name in English. It's somewhere between rust and old blood, this heavy, bruised amber that sits on top of you like a ceiling that's been lowered too far. The sun, if you can call it that, is a dim orange smear that barely cuts through the permanent haze of sulfur particulates. You breathe through a filter, always. You get 1 hour of unfiltered air per day in your bunk, if you're lucky, and the rest of the time you're sucking processed oxygen through a mask that smells faintly of rubber and someone else's fear. The ground is black volcanic rock, fractured into plates that shift slightly when you walk on them. Not enough to notice at first, just enough that after 6 hours of patrol you start feeling like the planet itself is trying to quietly slide you off its surface. There's a thin layer of gray dust over everything, the remains of some organic compound that the Vothrans had used in their initial planetary bombardment, 3 years before any human boots hit this ground. It settles in the creases of your armor, it gets into everything. And it's cold. Not the dramatic cold of a snow planet, not the cinematic freeze-your-breath-in-the-air cold. Just a relentless, seeping, bone-deep cold that doesn't announce itself. It just moves in quietly and takes up residence somewhere behind your sternum and doesn't leave. That was HFY. That was home for the 7th Combined Arms Division, 3rd Battalion, Echo Company. My company. We'd been on planet for 11 weeks. In that time, we'd lost 42 people. Not all at once, it was never all at once, which is somehow worse. It was steady. Attrition. 2 here, 1 there, a bad patrol here, a sudden artillery strike there. The kind of losing that doesn't feel dramatic in the moment. That just quietly hollows you out over weeks, until one day you're sitting in the mess looking around at the faces that are left and doing the arithmetic in your head, and feeling the number land somewhere in your gut like a stone. 42. Some of them I knew very well. Corporal Tinsley, who had a photograph of his daughter taped inside his helmet, and who used to do this thing where he'd hum old American football fight songs when the tension got bad. Specialist Adiz Nwasu, who was 23 years old and had the most genuinely ferocious poker face I've ever seen on a human being. Staff Sergeant Bogdan Vers, who'd been in this kind of fight since before I'd graduated basic training, who'd survived 4 separate combat deployments, who knew things about soldiering that they don't write in manuals. Gone. All of them gone in the slow, grinding way that this war consumed people. And yet, here's the thing I keep coming back to, we were still there. 11 weeks in, 42 lost, conditions that would have broken a lesser unit inside a month, and Echo Company was still there, still holding our sector, still getting up every morning when the rust-colored sky lightened by approximately 2 shades and calling it dawn and going back out. I didn't fully understand why until that last day, until I watched it happen. Let me tell you about the Vothrans, because you need to understand who we were fighting. The Vothran Collective is, and I say this with the kind of exhausted professional respect that soldiers sometimes develop for their enemies, extraordinarily good at war. They'd been doing it for 5 centuries. They'd conquered 14 star systems. They had military doctrine that was ancient and refined and layered with centuries of practical application. The way a blade gets refined over generations of use, each iteration sharper and more perfectly balanced than the last. They had fleet technology that outranged ours by a factor of 3. Their infantry units were faster than humans, slightly stronger, and had a reaction time that made them terrifying in close-quarters engagements. They were 7 feet tall, on average. Their body structure was vaguely bipedal but wrong in the way that things can be wrong when you're seeing something that's similar to familiar, but just offset enough to land in your nervous system like an error signal. They had a pair of primary arms in the expected location, and a secondary set that folded against their torso in neutral stance, but extended during combat, turning them into 4-armed weapons platforms. Their vision extended into spectrums that ours didn't, and they could process sensory input in parallel in a way that our brains simply weren't built to do. They did not feel fear the way we do. That's not a metaphor or a cultural observation, it's biological. They had fear responses, but those responses were narrower, more specific, less prone to the kind of cascading psychological effect that human fear can produce. They didn't spiral. They didn't freeze in the particular way humans freeze. They recalculated and they adapted and they kept coming. They had won this war on 14 other worlds before ours. And they had looked at the data on humanity, our population, our technology level, our military resources, our psychology, and they had arrived at a number, somewhere between 8 and 14 months for full capitulation. That was their projection. That was what their models said. We were now at month 27. That fact, that single, stubborn, mathematically improbable fact, was causing visible disturbance in the Vothran command structure. I know this because we had intelligence. Not good intelligence, not the kind of clean, precise information that military briefings in movies always seem to have. Messy, partial, sometimes contradictory intelligence that our analysts spent long hours arguing over in the back sections of the command post. But enough to know that the Vothran theater commander, an entity we called the Admiral for lack of a better translation for his actual title, had, on 3 separate occasions over the past 4 months, requested additional reinforcement and been denied. The collective had committed a specific number of resources to this campaign based on the projection. They hadn't budgeted for month 27. They were still winning. That's the part I need you to understand. They were still winning. They held the northern continent. They held the orbital platforms. They had more ships, more artillery, more of everything that a conventional military accounting would put in the winning column. But the cost was wrong. The timeline was wrong. And somewhere in the Vothran command structure, something that might have been the equivalent of unease was beginning to take hold. We were too slow to die. And on the morning of what our calendar marked as day 78 on Kareth 9, I think they decided to end it. Build tension. I was awake before the alert. This used to happen to me sometimes in long deployments. The brain learns the rhythms of danger, starts picking up on things before the conscious mind catches up. I was lying in my bunk in the reinforced structure we dug into the volcanic rock, and I was already awake, already looking at the ceiling, when the proximity sensors started screaming. Lieutenant Vance, my platoon commander, 26 years old from Johannesburg, had a habit of tapping the side of his helmet when he was thinking, was already at the tactical display when I got there. The rest of the command section was filtering in behind me, people still pulling on gear, still sealing armor seams, still running that automatic morning of combat checklist in their heads without even consciously thinking about it. "Talk to me," I said. "It's big," Vance said. His voice was flat. Not scared, Vance didn't do scared out loud, but flat in a way that I'd learned meant he was processing something that surprised him. Bigger than anything we've seen in this sector. He wasn't wrong. The display showed a Vothran advance force that was. I'm going to give you a moment to understand this. 5 times the size of anything they'd pushed through this sector in 11 weeks. 3 armored columns, converging on our position from the north and northeast. Vothran heavy infantry leading, those 7-foot-tall 4-armed infantry units in their angular black armor that absorbed light and radar in equal measure. Behind them, the machines. Vothran mechanized units are something that I will spend the rest of my life occasionally dreaming about and wishing I didn't. They moved on a combination of tracked and articulated limbs, partially mechanical, partially something that worked on a principle our engineers were still trying to reverse engineer, which meant they could traverse terrain that our vehicles couldn't. They were armed with plasma projection systems that could strip the shielding off a main battle tank in 2 hits and turn what was inside into something I will decline to describe in detail. There were 40 of them in this advance. We had 6 operable armored units in Echo Company's sector. Behind the mechanized force, there was something else, something we'd had intelligence on but hadn't seen in our sector before. Something the analysts had been calling, with the exhausted dark humor of people who have been reading terrible reports for too long, the hammer. The Vothrans had a weapon system. We didn't have a proper name for it yet. The technical designation was VHAB-7 in our logs. That was essentially a mobile siege platform. It was the size of a small building. It moved on 6 articulated legs, each one thick as an industrial support column, and it carried on its back a focused energy weapon that operated on a principle we still didn't fully understand but whose effects were unambiguous. It collapsed structures. Not just damaged them, collapsed them. It could turn a hardened bunker complex into flat ground in less time than it takes to describe. There were 2 of them in this advance. Our position, the underground complex we'd spent 6 weeks reinforcing, that we'd bled for, that 42 of our people had died defending, was built to withstand everything we'd faced so far. Artillery, infantry assault, aerial bombardment. We had layered defensive systems, hardened barriers, overlapping fields of fire. Against 2 VHAB-7 units, we had approximately nothing. Lieutenant Vance looked at me. I looked at the display. "How long?" I asked. "Until they're in range." He did the mental math. 40 minutes maybe, if they don't push the mechanized units ahead. 40 minutes. I thought about Corporal Tinsley's daughter. I thought about the photograph inside his helmet. I thought about whether someone had made sure that photograph went home with the rest of his personal effects. Then I thought about 42 people, and 3 armored columns in 40 minutes, and a structure that was about to become a very large grave. "Get me battalion command," I said, "and get everyone up. Full kit, full load. Anything that isn't nailed down goes into a defensive position. Now." The next 25 minutes were. Actually, you know what? I'm not going to try to make them cinematic. They weren't. They were exactly what this kind of work always is when you strip away all the film school grammar and the swelling music and the careful editing. They were loud and confusing and exhausting. People moved fast, and some things went right and some things went wrong, and there were arguments about positioning and arguments about ammunition allocation, and a section of the northern wall reinforcement collapsed during setup and had to be completely redone in 11 minutes. Which Corporal Mwanga's team did. Because when you tell the kind of people who have been on this rock for 11 weeks that something needs to happen in 11 minutes, it happens. We got the communication with Battalion on the third try. The first two attempts failed due to, and this was a recurring feature of this whole campaign, this beautiful, infuriating constant signal interference from the Vothran electronic warfare package. They ran ahead of every major operation. When we finally got through, the news from Battalion was not good. The assault on Echo Company's sector wasn't isolated. It was part of something larger, a simultaneous three-sector push along the entire Western engagement line. The Vothrans weren't just hitting us. They were hitting everybody. 7th and 2nd Companies were already engaged. Battalion Reserve was committed. Air support, our already limited, already stretched, already we don't have enough of it air support, was being prioritized to the eastern sector, where they were seeing the heaviest armor concentration. We were on our own. I remember exactly what the voice on the other end of that communication channel said. Not the words, but the tone. That particular combination of professional calm and absolute helplessness that command voices get when they're telling you something they know is inadequate. Echo Company, you are to hold your sector. Reinforcement is not available at this time. Hold until the situation develops. Hold until the situation develops. I said something in response to that. I will not repeat it here, because I'm told this story reaches a wide audience, but I said it clearly and calmly into the communication channel, and then I cut the link and turned back to my people. It was Specialist Haruto Yabe who saw them first. Yabe was one of those people who seemed, under normal circumstances, almost aggressively unremarkable. Medium height, quiet, had a habit of reading actual physical books that he'd somehow managed to carry through multiple deployments. When he laughed, which was infrequent and usually prompted by something that nobody else in the room had noticed was funny, it was this surprised, involuntary sound, like he'd caught himself before he could stop it. He was also, when it mattered, the best pair of eyes in the company. He was on the eastern observation point, one of our elevated sensor arrays, a platform we'd built into the upper structure of the complex, when he called it in. Sergeant Osei, you need to look at this. The way he said it, quiet, specific, without any of the urgency that this kind of moment was supposed to carry, is what made me move immediately. Yabe wasn't a dramatic person. If he said you needed to look at something with that exact tone, you needed to look at it. I got to the observation point and looked at the display he was pulling from the external sensor array. The 3 columns were there, still advancing, right on schedule, exactly where the tactical display had shown them. The mechanized units were visible now to the direct sensor array, those impossible moving machines, moving with that fluid mechanical organic wrongness across the black volcanic ground, the dust rising around their limbs in gray clouds that caught the amber light from above, and turned everything in that part of the view into something that looked like an old painting of hell. But that wasn't what Yabe had called me to see. There, he said. He pointed to the sensor feed from the northern array. What is that? I looked. And I didn't say anything for a moment. I just looked, because my brain needed a second to catch up with what my eyes were showing it. Coming from the west, from a direction that made no tactical sense, from a direction that I would have told you 30 seconds ago contained nothing but 3 kilometers of empty volcanic rock and the distant geological feature we'd been using as a navigation landmark, were human soldiers. Not a small group, not a patrol, not a couple of squads that had gotten themselves turned around. I counted the formation indicators on the sensor display, and I counted them again because the first count seemed wrong and the second count confirmed the first count, and I sat with that for a moment. 2 full battalions, approximately 1,400 soldiers. Moving in a formation I recognized, assault wedge, close interval, The kind of formation you use when you want everyone moving fast, and you're expecting contact immediately, across ground that should, by any conventional military assessment, have been impassable. At their head, moving at a pace that the sensor array tagged as slightly faster than standard combat advance, was a unit I didn't immediately recognize by their armor markings. It took me a moment, a fraction of a second that felt longer, to place them. 83rd Armored Rangers. One of the deep penetration units. Special operations capability, extreme environmental training, the kind of unit that exists because someone in high command looked at the regular army and thought, what if we took the people who are already doing something impossible and asked them to do something impossible faster and in worse conditions? Where did they come from? Yabe said. I don't know, I said. And I didn't. I genuinely didn't. Not yet. I would find out later, much later in the aftermath, in the weeks of debriefs and official accounts, and the informal conversations that soldiers have when they're trying to understand something. Exactly what that force had gone through to be in that position at that moment. But right then, standing at the observation array, watching the sensor display show me 1,400 human soldiers moving at combat pace from a direction that made no sense. I didn't know any of that. I just watched them come. The climax. The Vothrans saw them at approximately the same time we did. I know this because the advance changed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of thing that looks decisive in the moment. But I'd spent 11 weeks studying Vothran tactical movement, and I recognized what I was seeing. The rightmost armored column paused its advance for approximately 90 seconds, tiny, almost invisible hesitation by the standards of large unit movement, and then shifted its axis of approach by maybe 15 degrees. They were turning to meet the new threat. And something happened then that I have thought about many times since. The 83rd didn't slow down. I need you to understand what that means in military terms, because it's easy to say and harder to grasp. They were looking at the same thing we were looking at from our sensors. They had their own intelligence. They knew the size of the force advancing toward them. They knew about the mechanized units. They almost certainly knew about the VHAB-7 siege platforms, because any unit operating in this theater would have been briefed on those. And they were a force of 1,400 soldiers, highly trained, yes, experienced, yes, but a force that was designed for penetration and disruption, not frontal engagement with a major armored advance. The math was not good. Even from where I was standing, the math was not good. And they did not slow down. What happened in the next 47 minutes is something I can only give you pieces of. No one person saw all of it. The full picture only assembled itself later, from sensor data and survivor accounts, and the post-action reports that took 3 months to compile. But I'll tell you what I saw, and what the sensors showed me, and I'll do my best to make it feel like what it actually felt like, which was not cinematic and not clean, and not anything like the stories you've heard. The first contact came at the northern edge of the approach. The 83rd lead elements meeting the flank of the Vothran mechanized column that had shifted to address them. The sensor display tracked it as a heat signature event. The plasma systems on the Vothran machines firing, the answering signatures of the 83rd's anti-armor weapons, the scrambled geometry of a contact engagement in the narrow visual language of a tactical sensor array. Then communications. Not with us, I want to be clear about that. We were still holding our position, still watching, still waiting for the moment when we'd need to commit our own people. What I was getting was fragments of the 83rd's internal communications that our system was picking up, not clean, not complete, interference everywhere, but enough. Enough to hear the voice of whoever was commanding that forward element, calling positions and movement corrections with the specific, almost irritating calm of someone who has made a decision and is now simply executing it, and is not interested in revisiting the question of whether it was a good decision. First element, push left, Hargrove. I need your section at the depression, move. A burst of interference. They're bringing the second column around. We have maybe 3 minutes before. Static. I know what it looks like, Sergeant, push left. Here is the thing about the Vothrans and their tactical doctrine that becomes relevant here. Their models for engagement, those sophisticated probability matrices that had served them well in 14 campaigns, were built on observed patterns of behavior from the species they'd fought before. And those patterns, without exception, included one reliable constant. When a smaller force meets a larger force with superior firepower in an open engagement, the smaller force seeks to disengage, establish defensive advantage, buy time, wait for conditions to change. Every species they'd fought had done this. It was, if you thought about it, rational. It was the tactically sound response to being outgunned in the open. The 83rd was not doing this. The 83rd was not seeking to disengage or establish defensive advantage or wait for conditions to change. The 83rd was pushing into the mechanized column. Not the way you'd expect, not a headlong charge, not something tactically reckless. It was methodical and it was precise, and it used the terrain in a way that I would only understand fully when I read the post-action analysis, which described it as one of the most sophisticated improvised assault approaches their analysts had seen in this campaign. But the direction of it was unmistakable. They were going in. And the Vothran advance, that massive, calibrated 5-to-1 superiority force that had been 40 minutes from reducing our position to geology, was beginning, in small ways, to become disordered. I want to tell you about a specific moment because I think it captures something. There's a section of the sensor data from that engagement. It runs for about 4 minutes, roughly 30 minutes into the contact, that I've reviewed many times. It covers the area where the 83rd's right flank pushed into the gap between the 1st and 2nd Vothran mechanized columns. The gap shouldn't have been exploitable. It was there because of the column's rotation to address the new threat, a temporary geometric feature, the kind of thing that closes in minutes as units move and the formation adjusts. Any conventional assessment would have said it was too narrow, too temporary, too well covered by the flanking elements of both columns to be used. Sergeant Major Eleni Vasquez, I would learn her name later in the debrief, in the accounts, took 16 people through it. 16 people through a gap that shouldn't have been a gap, between two Vothran mechanized columns that were actively trying to close it, under fire from the flanking elements, in terrain that the sensor data tags as severely degraded, which is the technical way of saying broken volcanic rock, poor footing, low visibility from the dust and the smoke of the engagement, every single disadvantage stacked in the environment's favor. On the other side of that gap was the logistics tail of the second column, the fuel and ammunition handlers for the mechanized units, the support elements that keep a mechanized force moving. I will not describe in detail what Vasquez's 16 people did to that logistics tail. I'll just tell you that when the mechanized units in the second column needed to bring their plasma systems to optimal output for sustained engagement, the power delivery was degraded, not destroyed, degraded. That's an important distinction. It didn't neutralize the column, but it changed the numbers, changed the timeline, changed the shape of what was possible. 4 minutes of sensor data, 16 people. Meanwhile, something was happening to the Vothran advance that I had not expected to see. It was slowing, not collapsing. I want to be clear about that. The Vothrans are not the kind of military force that collapses. They are professional and experienced and extremely capable, and even in a disordered situation they don't break. But slowing is something different from breaking, and it was unmistakable. The 3-column advance that had been 40 minutes from overrunning our position had become, through the combination of the 83rd's assault and the disruption to the logistics tail and several other things that were happening simultaneously across the battlefield, something more complicated, something that required attention and response and recalculation. And recalculation takes time. And time, in this context, was not something the Vothrans had in unlimited supply. This is where Echo Company came in. I've told you about the 42 people we'd lost, about the 11 weeks and the grinding attrition and the cold and the dust and the rust-colored sky. I've told you about the photograph inside Corporal Tinsley's helmet. What I haven't told you about is the 106 people we still had. 106 people who had been through everything I just described, who had been awake since the proximity alert, who had spent 25 minutes moving fast in very bad circumstances to reinforce positions, and who were now, in the observation of what was happening outside our walls, beginning to understand that the situation had changed. Not reversed, changed. The massive advance was still out there. The VHAB-7 units were still out there, 6 legs each, moving in that terrible, slow, deliberate way, still technically aimed at our location. The Vothran infantry and mechanized forces still substantially outnumbered everything on our side of this fight. But they were not moving the way they had been moving 20 minutes ago. And Lieutenant Vance, who was 26 years old and from Johannesburg, and who tapped the side of his helmet when he was thinking, was doing exactly that, tapping the side of his helmet, staring at the tactical display, working through something. "They've split their attention," he said. "Yes," I said. "If the 83rd keeps the right column engaged for another." He was working the math, 20 minutes, maybe 25, the geometry of this changes. "Yes," I said. He turned and looked at me. "You're not going to like what I'm about to say." "Probably not," I said. "Say it anyway." "If we go out and hit the left column, while they're managing the 83rd on the right." "We are one company," I said. "One company with 6 armored units, against a column with 15 mechanized platforms and 2 VHAB-7s. I know. The VHAB-7s alone." "I know," he said. He held my gaze. He was 26 years old, and in his eyes was that particular expression that I had learned over 11 weeks of working alongside him. That expression that meant he had already made the calculation, already arrived at the place where the math was terrible and the alternative was worse, and was now waiting for me to get there too. I got there. "Get everyone in position," I said. "Everything. All 6 armor units in front, infantry behind, missiles first, and then we push into whatever's still standing. Tell them." I stopped, thought for a moment. Tell them the 83rd punched through from the west. Tell them they're not alone out there. Vance almost smiled. It was a very small almost smile, the kind that doesn't involve the mouth much. "Copy that," he said. "What I remember about going out through the eastern gate is the sound. We had, and this is something that feels almost too small to mention in the context of what I've just been describing, but I'm going to mention it anyway because it's the thing I remember most clearly. We had a corporal named Adisa who played music on an old handheld speaker before every engagement. Small speaker, very low volume, barely audible over the ambient noise of the camp. Old earth music. His particular choice rotated, but it was always something with a specific quality, something that felt like it was meant to be played in exactly this kind of moment. That morning he had something playing that I didn't recognize. It was, I want to be precise here, not aggressive music. It wasn't the kind of thing that sounds like a pre-battle soundtrack. It was something quieter and older, something that felt like it was about endurance rather than ferocity, about the very long tradition of human beings standing in terrible places and deciding to take one more step. We went out through the eastern gate. 106 people. I'm not going to walk you through the engagement minute by minute, because the honest truth is that even if I could reconstruct it with perfect accuracy, which I can't, because combat doesn't store itself in memory the way a recording does, It stores itself in fragments and impressions and the sensory details that happen to attach themselves to moments of extreme stress. It wouldn't help you understand what it felt like. What it felt like was fast, and loud and cold, and full of the specific darkness of making decisions with partial information and no good options. What it felt like was 106 people doing something that the Vothran probability matrices said they should not be doing. The left column, the one that was still nominally aimed at our position, the one that hadn't been pulled fully into the engagement with the 83rd, was in a state that I can only describe as something being wrong with its attention. Not vulnerable, not broken, but wrong. Major operations require coordination. Coordination requires communication. Communication, under the pressure of an unexpected engagement on your right flank, while your artillery support is suddenly being used to address a disruption in your logistics chain, and your mechanized elements are burning more power than projected, and the assault timeline you'd built your whole operational plan around is now running 15 minutes behind schedule. Communication, under those conditions, is imperfect. We hit them in that imperfection. Our 6 armor units went first. Our 6 battered, 11 weeks operational, held together with the human equivalent of Hope armored vehicles, pushing out ahead and drawing the immediate response of the column's forward mechanized units. 2 of our armor units went down in the first 3 minutes. 1 immediately, 1 a few minutes later when its shielding gave out under sustained fire. 4 left. Our anti-armor teams were working, Yabe's section on the left, a team under a corporal named Dara on the right, and the Vothran mechanized units were taking hits. Not catastrophic hits, not the kind that ended them immediately, but cumulative damage, the kind that requires power from already stressed systems to compensate, the kind that adds to the disorder already propagating through the column. And then something happened that I don't think anyone planned. One of the HFY units, the siege platforms, the things that had been the reason we were all supposed to be dead by the end of this day, turned. Not toward us. That would have been catastrophic and obvious. It turned toward the engagement on the right flank, toward where the 83rd was still pushing into the mechanized column and still somehow, impossibly, maintaining pressure. In retrospect, I think I understand what happened. The HFY operators, whatever Vothran crew was inside those massive 6-legged things, were responding to the greater threat. The 83rd had gotten far enough into the right column structure that they were now registering as a higher priority target than the fixed fortification they'd been dispatched to destroy. Which meant the siege platform that had been aimed at us was aimed, for a few minutes, at something else. Those few minutes. Sergeant First Class Dara Osei, 104 remaining people, 2 more in the armor engagement, and a window that was not an opportunity in any conventional sense, but was the closest thing to one that this day was going to produce. I called Lieutenant Vance. The left HFY just rotated toward the 83rd, I said. A very brief pause on his end. Not long, just enough to confirm that he'd also seen it and was processing the same information. The right one, he said. Still aimed at the complex, I said, but it's not firing. Another pause. The reason it's not firing, Vance said slowly, is because we're not in the complex. Right, I said. So if we're not going back to the complex, it has nothing to shoot at, I said, and if it decides to reallocate, it'll choose the 83rd, he said, because the 83rd is the active threat. That's my read, I said. So we need to keep not being in the complex, Vance said, and we need to keep not being a low-threat presence. We need to commit everything, I said. We need to look like the active threat. Vance did not hesitate. All elements, he said into the company-wide channel. Push forward everything. We are the most dangerous thing on this battlefield right now. Act like it. 104 people. against a Vothran column that still outnumbered them in every measurable way, acting like the most dangerous thing on the battlefield. The resolution. Here is what happened, in the flat language of the after-action report that would eventually be filed, reviewed, and formally entered into the military record of the Karath 9 campaign. At approximately 8:47 local time, elements of the 7th Combined Arms Division Echo Company, in conjunction with the 83rd Armored Rangers and attached support elements, disrupted and effectively repelled the Vothran Western Sector offensive. The right mechanized column of the Vothran advance suffered critical logistics and systems disruption, resulting in significant degradation of operational capacity. The left column, subjected to sustained pressure from Echo Company elements, failed to achieve its primary objective, destruction of human fixed fortifications, and was ultimately forced into a retrograde movement as coordination with the right column broke down. Both VHAB-7 platforms withdrew with the main body of the Vothran force. Total advance was halted at 5.4 kilometers short of the original objective. 5.4 kilometers. That's how far they didn't get. What the after-action report doesn't tell you, because after-action reports are not built to hold this kind of information, is what it felt like when the withdrawal indicators started showing on the sensor display. I was at a forward position by then. I'd moved up during the engagement, the way you do when you need to see what's actually happening rather than just read it off a display. And I had a direct line of sight on part of the engagement when the Vothran columns began to pull back. It's not like the movies. There's no single decisive moment, no clear beat where you can point and say, there, that's when it changed. It's gradual and you're not sure at first that what you're seeing is real. You've been in this kind of situation long enough to have developed a reflexive skepticism toward good news, a deep reluctance to believe that the thing that looks like it's going your way is actually going your way rather than being set up for something worse. But it kept going. The right column's forward elements pulled back and didn't re-engage. The mechanized units, some of them moving less smoothly than before, one of them with visible damage to its articulated limbs, began the process of consolidation that precedes withdrawal. And then, unmistakably, the whole column began to move in the direction it had come from. And then the left column. And then the VHAB-7 units, those six-legged buildings, those things that had been the fundamental reason this day was supposed to be our last, those started moving too. West. Away. I don't know exactly when I understood that we had, against everything the math had suggested, survived the morning. I think it was when I heard a sound near me that took me a moment to identify, because I hadn't heard it in a while. Someone laughing. Not the bitter, tight kind of laughter that happens in combat situations when something is too awful to respond to any other way. The other kind. The genuine, involuntary, can't-help-it kind, coming from somewhere to my left. I turned and looked. Corporal Mwangi, whose team had rebuilt the northern wall reinforcement in 11 minutes that morning, who I would have described, if someone had asked me 6 months earlier, as a person who seemed almost constitutionally incapable of looking surprised, was standing there with his helmet off and his head tilted back, and he was laughing at the amber sky. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then he caught himself, saw me looking, put his helmet back on with the particular dignity of someone pretending the last 4 seconds didn't happen. "Sir," he said. "Corporal," I said. We stood there for a moment in the dusty, cold, sulfur-tinged air of Karath 9. "They're actually leaving," he said. "They're leaving," I said. The 83rd Rangers reached our position about 90 minutes after the Vothran withdrawal was confirmed. I want to tell you what that looked like, because I think it's important. They came in from the west, across that black volcanic ground, and I want to be accurate about this, not dramatic, they were in rough shape. The way that units are in rough shape after a hard engagement, armor with damage evidence, people moving with the careful, deliberate movements of people who have been in close contact and are still running on the specific alert of the aftermath, some of them supported by others. They'd taken serious casualties in the engagement. I would learn the number later. It was not a small number, and I won't minimize it. But they were walking, and the column they'd engaged was not. The unit commander of the 83rd, the person who had been the voice I'd heard in the fragmented communications, calling positions and corrections in that specific comm, was a lieutenant colonel named Yolanda Furrer. She was not tall. She was not dramatically commanding in the way that movie military officers tend to be. She was compact, and she had close-cropped gray hair, and she was carrying a piece of damaged equipment in one hand in a way that suggested she'd picked it up, because she was going to need it repaired, and hadn't found a place to put it down yet. She stopped when she reached the first of our people, and she looked around at the position, and then she looked at me. "Echo Company," she said. "What's left of it," I said. She looked at the damage to our outer positions, at the evidence of the engagement. Then she looked back at me with an expression that was. It was something. I'm not sure I have the right word for it. It wasn't congratulatory because she wasn't that kind of person. It wasn't surprised. It was something more specific than either of those. "They told me your sector was about to go under when we got the briefing," she said. "That was the general expectation, yes," I said. She nodded slowly, then she said, "You went out." "We went out," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "My people saw you on their sensor feeds," she said. "When you came out of the eastern gate, we were about 22 minutes into the engagement with the right column." She paused. "Some of my people thought you were Vothrans at first, because of where you were coming from." "We do look different on a sensor feed," I said. And then someone said, "No, they're moving wrong for Vothrans." She said it with something that might have been the very distant cousin of a smile. "They're moving too fast, and they're coming from the wrong direction, and there are too few of them for any rational operation." "That's accurate," I said. She looked at me for a moment longer. "How many did you go out with?" 106, I said. "Started the day with 106. She heard the past tense. "And now?" I thought about it, about the count I'd been running in my head for the last 3 hours, about the names I'd need to write, the notifications that would need to be made, the families that were going to receive the information that the military transmitted when it had to deliver the worst thing it could deliver. 88, I said. Furrer was quiet. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it the way soldiers mean it when they say it to each other, not as a social formula, not as a convention, but as the thing it actually is, an acknowledgement of what a number like that costs. "You went out anyway," she said, not a question. "We went out anyway," I said. There's a moment in the days after a battle, not immediately after, not in the hours of shock and aftermath and damage assessment and casualty reporting, and all the immediate business that surviving requires, but a few days after, when the immediate noise quiets down, and you have enough space to start processing what happened. I was sitting in what passed for a common area in our underground complex, 3 days after the engagement. The complex that had been scheduled for demolition by 2 walking siege platforms at approximately 8:50 on that morning, and was instead, improbably, still standing. Yabe was there with one of his actual physical books. The book was damaged, water damage, or maybe it was the dust, and he was reading it anyway, holding it carefully. A few other people nearby, talking quietly or not talking, or doing the specific thing that soldiers in the aftermath do, where they sit in the same space and don't talk, but the being in the same space is itself a kind of communication. I was thinking about the Vothran probability matrices. I was thinking about their models, their projections, They're 5 centuries of data on how wars go and how species behave, and what happens when the numbers are this lopsided. I was thinking about what it would look like, on their side of this, when they ran the analysis of what had happened, when they fed in the raw data of a single company going out a gate against a 5-to-1 force that had siege platforms, when their models tried to account for an assault unit pushing into a mechanized column rather than seeking defensive advantage, when they tried to figure out what variable explained the gap between what their projections said should have happened and what actually happened. I thought about what that variable was. It wasn't anything complicated. It wasn't some tactical genius, some secret technology, some hidden capability that we'd been holding in reserve. It was the thing that had been there the whole time. The thing that had kept Echo Company on its feet for 11 weeks and 42 lost, and one more morning. The thing that had sent 1,400 Rangers across impassable terrain from the wrong direction into a fight that the math said wasn't winnable. The Vothrans had modeled our technology and our numbers and our tactical doctrine. They'd modeled our biology and our response times and our communication infrastructure. They hadn't modeled the other thing, the thing that doesn't show up in probability matrices, because it doesn't behave the way probability matrices expect things to behave. The thing that makes a 106-person company go out a gate. Ending line. I read something once. I don't remember where, something from before all of this, from back when I had the kind of life where I read things for reasons other than intelligence briefings, about why human beings, across every culture and every period of history, tell stories about the moments when something was supposed to be finished and wasn't. The writer's argument was that these stories aren't really about triumph. They're not about winning. They're about the specific and very human refusal to let the ending be the ending. They're about the interval, the gap between the moment when everything says it's over and the moment when someone decides it isn't. That gap, the writer said, is where human beings live. Not in the winning, not even in the surviving. In the going out the gate. 88 people came back through the eastern gate that morning. The Vothran Western Sector offensive never reached its objective. And somewhere, I imagine, in whatever passes for a strategic analysis room in the Vothran Collective, someone is still trying to figure out what went wrong with their numbers. I hope they keep trying. I hope it keeps not making sense to them. Because as long as it doesn't make sense to them, as long as that gap between what their models predict and what we actually do remains in the calculations, as long as they can't account for it, we haven't lost. The galaxy thought the math had spoken. But nobody told us we were supposed to stop. And that, in the end, is the only thing that ever actually mattered.